Hello and welcome to our monthly look at the world of aviation and air traffic control. My name's Anthony Hatch. I'm an operations manager at London Luton Airport, and I'm delighted you can join us for this month's episode of Altitude. Now, with the arrival of spring and as the warmer weather we've all seen this week, probably some of the best weather we've had in a long time, consistent for flying, I know that all of the aviation enthusiasts there will be flocking out to the skies. And what we'd really like to do is support the GA community on a safe start to flying again for this year. We know the past 2 years there's been problems with going in and out of flying, and GA actually has had a bit of a resurgence last year, but that hasn't been the same for commercial aviation. So last year, when any problems with navigation, getting close to controlled airspace, or unfortunately into controlled airspace may not have had such a ramification, now with the return to commercial flying, we'll probably find that there may be more problems on our hands if those errors do occur. Now, I must admit to being a very keen GA pilot myself. I'm an instructor at 2 aerodromes in the local area at Weston and Cranfield. And when I do get a spare couple of hours, I fly my favourite, which is a 70-year-old Chipmunk based out of Wellesbourne. But enough about me. I'm very pleased to be able to have two very famous faces from the world of aviation join us today, and that is Mike O'Donoghue from Gasco and Amanda Rhodes from NATS. And Amanda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. My name is Amanda Rhodes. I have been with NATS 21 years. I have been on Luton radar since 2005 and the sector formerly known as Essex, which is now Stansted radar, since 2002. Mike, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I started off in general aviation really after school and did a bit there. And then I joined the military and I spent 33 years as a service pilot, flying quite a lot of things, mainly helicopters for most of the time. And then I left and spent the last 20 or more years in civil aviation. And I'm currently an instructor and an examiner. I'm on rotary wing aircraft, and I fly fixed wing a little bit. And I've been the chief executive of the General Aviation Safety Council now for 11 years.
Mike, thank you. Amanda, thank you. So what are some of the things you think general aviation pilots can do to ensure flying is both safe and enjoyable? From my own perspective, I'm very much one of these who believes in planning straight from the off on the ground. A safe flight starts with everything that you do on the ground before you get anywhere in the air. That's having a good look at the charts. And I'm old school. I'll use paper charts. I do use moving map devices as well, but the paper charts are there with the moving map to confirm that everything is going as it should do. Using basic principles like the take two, making sure you are 200 feet below controlled airspace, for example, at least 2 miles away from controlled airspace. So if you do get those minor navigational errors, then hopefully taking those margins will help you out. Mike, from the Gasco perspective, what do you think?
Well, I mean, absolutely endorse what you say. I would add to it, it's not just controlled airspace, and anything else you want to avoid, notified airspace, and particularly perhaps gliding sites. They are, the British Gliding Association, incredibly worried about those at the moment because GA pilots regularly overfly them, and it is very dangerous potentially. So a lot more information available about that if you want to contact me at Gasco or one of our safety evenings. We'll tell you all about it. Going back to the specifics of preparing yourself, well, obviously people in the winter may not have done as much flying as normal for all the usual reason of waterlogged aerodromes, airfields, and the weather. And perhaps if you're in an open you don't have a canopy on your aircraft, maybe that's another good reason you're not too keen to take to the skies and so on. And that would apply to paragliders as well and people like that. And the conditions also, may not be terribly good, not so many thermic conditions for gliders and things like that. So lots of reasons why we might be rusty. And so, take it easy would be the best advice. Don't try something incredibly difficult on day one. Work out your flight. Our safety evenings this year are concentrating on 3 themes. We want to reinforce what Anthony said is plan your flight. So many flights that end with an occurrence or an incident or an accident, when we look at them in detail, and from the comfort of our own armchairs, it has to be said, it's quite evident that more planning could have been done. And that's often the admission too of the pilots concerned. So plan your flight, drill it down, use everything, you know, I mean, just use Google Maps or something. That will give you lots of information on landmarks and photorealistic things. There's everything there. So good planning. Use the chart. So much information on it, and of course the moving map displays and apps that you can get are really good as well. So plan your flight. Use threat and error management is the other thing one of the other things we're talking about, and that is to identify all the threats. Keep it as simple as you like, but make sure you do it. You know, so threats are things you can't do anything about. They're coming at you, as it were. So weather will be a good example of that. You can't do anything about the weather. It is what it is. So make sure you get the big picture on the weather and understand what's going on, as well as all the other information associated with it. So that's really, really important. And identify any errors you might make, perhaps setting the wrong pressure setting. You know, that's a classic. So how would you know that? What procedures would you have? How would you trap it? How would you mitigate it or manage it? It all boils down to, I suppose, you know, ask yourself a question before you go, you know, what's going to get me today? And think it through, and then think, well, what am I going to do about it? So flying this evening, maybe, it was a nice day, perhaps it's very high pressure, slightly hazy maybe, flying in the evening, lovely sunset's not till quite late. But what if I'm going to the west? Could be very hazy. That'd be a threat to visibility, wouldn't it? So what am I going to do about it? Not just say it. I'm actually going to do something about it. I'm going to put a dogleg in my course or go a slightly different way. And so I'm not looking up sun. So managing is the key there. And finally, the final point, the third point we make is, remember, you're a human. We're humans. We will react in particular ways. We're not brilliant at airborne decision making, and actually, in many cases, decision making under pressure in any circumstances. We'll suffer from startle effect. Our physique will blot out certain things under situations of stress. Under high stress, we'll have auditory exclusion. The hearing will go. Now, you've probably heard that, you know, in other things. You know, you'll blot it out. You're talking to somebody in the car when you're driving, and suddenly the navigation, the roundabout or whatever it is, or the lane change becomes really quite difficult. So you shut off everybody else and you stop talking. And nothing you can do about that. But what you can do is manage it or realize it's coming. And we'll say a bit more about what we might do to help that, I'm sure, during the afternoon.
Thank you, Mike. I'm amazed actually talking to some pilots how threat and error management doesn't even compute in what they do. And when you explain the principles to them, you can see the light bulb goes on, and it's such a benefit to how they manage the flight. Effectively, what they're doing is managing the flight before they even get off the ground. Amanda, outside of the box, what about from the ATCO perspective? What can pilots do to plan ahead, ensure they get a better experience?
Well, from the ATCO perspective, is have a plan B. If you have planned your flight through the overhead, let's take, for example, Luton, go from A to B, you want to go via the Luton overhead. That may not always be possible if we're busy, complex situation, poor weather. I may offer you an alternative routing that you're not expecting. And if you're not expecting it, I may throw you slightly. So you're going to be looking, where is it on the map? So have an alternative routing that will take you outside controlled airspace in case, on the occasions that we can't let you through controlled airspace through the overhead, or if you offer you a different routing west of Dunstable Downs, we may offer you something different. So just be ready for that. So have a plan B would be my advice.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I went flying 2 weeks ago from Wellesbourne to North Weald and couldn't get through Luton's airspace. So there I was going around through the gap there. So this is having a plan B here. Navigational skills, Mike, how is it important to keep these up to date?
Well, obviously, you know, if you talk about airspace infringements or going into controlled airspace, the subject you were just talking about, or clearances, if you don't know where you are or you're not accurate about it, then clearly it's going to be very important. we may find that they need refreshing from time to time. Sometimes we're very familiar with the area we fly or the route we fly, and therefore we think we're all great navigators, but it's possible if we now move ourselves to a place where we don't really recognize the ground, to a different part of the country, we suddenly realize that our navigation skills are not perhaps all they should be. So that's a great area to practice and think about. If you use a moving map display, it should improve your navigation because it will tell you where you are, where you're heading, and where you intended to go. And you can do that at form at a glance. So really, we think they're great, but of course, they're subject to errors too. If you haven't updated it, and be near a Wi-Fi, but you planned the trip yesterday, then the wind applied will be yesterday's wind. Also, forecast winds have a habit of not being quite right. I think we all know that. So a bit of a gross error check. Now, bear in mind that you may be suffering from local effects, sea breezes or microclimate and wind, which will make this needed to, take it with, some caution. But if you look at the windsock and see where the wind's coming, and you're going to fly at 2,000 feet, then you add 30 degrees to that heading. That's where the wind will be coming. If you now look at your plog and have a look at it and see, well, actually, my wind up there is 180 degrees out. I'm not suggesting necessarily that that's wrong, but I would be very, I'd have a very good look at it and think about it and monitor it. Look for the wind, from as I flew over the countryside from bonfires and things like that. As far as the skills of navigation go, my practical tips are fly on track, stay on track. A lot of people plan a route between two aerodromes, say 2G aerodromes, and they just draw the line between the top of the aerodrome that they're departing from to the one they're going to. And that's fine if you are confident you're going to do an overhead departure and an arrival, an overhead rejoin. The latter may not be possible because the runway's changed since you got there. That could happen. And mostly we don't go with overhead departures apart from those early navigation training sorties. We tend to go from somewhere else. So I would work out the point at which I am going to depart from. Say it's that motorway junction to the southwest or whatever it is outside the ATZ. But I'll put that as my start point because I know visually I'll have no difficulty getting there at all. Frankly, if I did have any difficulty getting there, it's obviously not good enough to fly, so I'm coming back home anyway. And then I would probably plan to what would, in my former life, we'd call an initial point, just a well-chosen landmark, probably outside the other ATZ, or controlled airspace or whatever. It could be a VRP, a visual reference point, but somewhere that I can see that possibly has vertical extent and that I'm not going to miss. And and that's my track. And I'd try and look at easily identifiable objects en route. If you're using a moving map display, you can actually get the aerial photograph, and there's a great big stately home and park over there. You could put that in as a waypoint. You'll see it. And it may not be on the aeronautical chart. So, that's all about planning, isn't it? It's just what Anthony said at the beginning. It's plan, plan, plan. And when you've done that, start off, adopt the heading that you've calculated or estimated, set off on it, and note the track error very quickly, I would suggest. And my advice to people is think a bit like a VOR homing or something, where you try and get on that radial as soon as you can and stay on it. Because if you actually allow the track error to build up and then halfway along the track, you notice, right, I'm 2 miles to the west of track, I'm going to make a closing angle track error correction, however you do it, to get back on track. The one thing you've never done in that flight is fly on track, which is the one you meant to do to avoid airspace, noise abatement restrictions, wanted to see the fixes coming up in the right place, i.e. in front of you. So those are my top tips for navigation, and you can practice that over the next week or so before you start flying. Very easy. It's great fun too.
There's some really good points there, Mark. And it's one of the things that I try and teach students when we're doing navigation. As you said, they draw the line directly from the overhead of the airfield they're departing from. And if they turn and just point on track to where they think they're going, you've already started your navigation route with an error that you've forced upon yourself. And your navigation is only as good from you starting at a known point and flying for an accurate heading for an accurate time. And if you don't start at that correct point, you're out straight away. And the errors, of course, can compound. Now, I know there's some good stuff that Gasco does there, Mike, which I'd like to ask you a bit in a minute. But when it does go wrong, Amanda, you're on the receiving end of infringements here. It's a long time since I've done radar. So what is your perspective when you have to deal with an infringement? What are the knock-on effects?
The knock-on effects, if we're busy and if the infringer is heading straight for your airfield, you're looking immediately. If don't know who they're talking to, where they're going, safety comes first. Am I going to lose separation? Have I lost separation? Do I need to regain separation? So I can be on the phone to the tower, priority line. I need to stop departures. Do you have anything rolling? Yes or no? Do I need to work it? Inbound traffic, you start breaking the inbounds off. We then get into potentially airborne holding because, again, you don't know where your infringer's going. The actions are unknown. And it can escalate very quickly. And calling for help, your colleagues will always be the first to get help back for you. But it doesn't take much for it to escalate. Again, the delays on the ground can build up depending on how long that aircraft is there for. But again, bringing around other units, blind transmissions. If the aircraft has a mode Sierra transponder, you can see the call sign. I might give them a blind transmission. Adjacent units, I'll ask Farnborough, being because they provide the last service in the gap between Stansted and Luton. But you just don't know. You just don't know how long they're going to be there for and how long you're going to be holding for. So again, it is a matter of everything becomes non-standard at that point. Again, holding at non-standard altitudes, non-standard circuits, you're trying to vector away and trying to maintain separation until you find out who this little infringer is and where they're going.
It's astronomical workload that can build up really quickly.
It doesn't take much.
No, and the thing is, in the air, Amanda, what you're dealing with is aircraft that's still moving. I'm moving with aircraft on the ground, which I can tell to stop. Mike, Gasco does some great work with infringement education. What is it that people are generally getting wrong at the moment?
That's an interesting question. We do see quite a lot of people who come to us to do a course following an infringement rather, and we also run free infringement awareness avoidance webinars. The next one's actually on the 4th of April. If anybody wants it, we'll put the links up afterwards. I'm sure it's all free of charge. Do come along. But we obviously read a lot of infringement reports and we talk to a lot of people. And the first thing to say is that they're not intentional. We've not really ever come across anybody that did it deliberately. And they're often mortified about it. And some are a bit angry as well because they're usually angry with themselves for a slip. So what are the root causes? Well, there are quite a few. One of them, I think, is knowledge. People do have gaps in their knowledge. The Skyway Code is absolutely fabulous reference book. So I would urge you to have a look at the airspace section of that and, make sure that you really understand all the latest changes. Because if you don't understand what a TMZ is or what an RMZ is, then you don't really stand much chance of avoiding it, do you? So that's the first point. ATZs, aerodrome traffic zones, are quite often infringed, but people don't know sometimes what you have to do to go through an ATZ. So if it's an AG service, you must find out, it's your duty to announce your intention to penetrate the ATZ, your whereabouts with it and when you're leaving it, and to obtain all the information on traffic you can. The same really for if it's controlled by an information call sign, you're the same there. And of course, if it's controlled by a tower frequency, as some are, then actually that's effectively like Class D, you have to get clearance to go in. So if you don't know that, then, trouble's going to happen, isn't it, really? So the first thing is knowledge. Then the other one we see quite a lot is distraction. People get distracted by things. And because actually, and this may go back to some of the early points, we're not in current flying practice or very recent flying practice. Nobody would fly if they're not current, but we might not have flown for a while, and the workload builds up. And if the workload builds up, then our attention on other things goes, and that's natural. We fly for fun in GA in the main. I know there are exceptions. We deal with people who fly, for emergency services, police, and charter operations, businesses. But at the same time, the majority would probably be flying because it's a nice day like today, and they want to get out and fly with their friends. Now, here's the thing: if you're flying with your friend or a relative or something, you want to give them a good experience. But the danger is one comes into a bit of a tour guide mode and you're concentrating on talking to the passenger, explaining that that's the tallest cathedral in the UK or whatever it is. And meanwhile, you're not paying attention to the instruments. When you're flying a commercial airliner, of course, the passengers are behind a locked door. Somebody else is managing them on the commander's behalf. And you generally have rules that mean that you'll just concentrate with the volume up on the radio and only talk about the business of flying. Now, we're not suggesting for a minute in Gasco that anybody tries to take the fun out of your flying, but you do need to remember that it's easy to be distracting. A passenger being sick, well, it's pretty unfortunate, unpleasant and nasty for all concerned, but it is unlikely to be life-threatening. But if you then manage to get yourself so distracted that you then infringe airspace, and Amanda, say, is not able to maintain separation or has to, do something else, goodness knows what could run on as a knock-on effect. So, try to manage that. Say, look, sorry about that. If you've got another passenger, can you help them? And I'll give you some attention later, but try and do that. Top tip we used to give for us people who might be, if you're feeling a bit queasy, tell me, but try not to make people put it into their mind. What I always used to do is tell them to unbutton the top button of their blouse or shirt and put their head in there and deep breathe for a bit.
Thank you, Mike.
It has no effect on the whether you're going to be sick or not, but it makes cleaning the aircraft up a lot easier.
Some good.
There are some other things on that. I mean, I've mentioned distraction, but also perhaps more seriously flying. You mentioned the 200-foot suggestion. Well, 200 foot's not a lot, and you might want to consider more. That is another one that people. It's very easy. I know it's certainly for me. If I'm concentrating on something, I'm a flying instructor, I want to do a demonstration. The book says I have to do a perfect demonstration. Those are the words it uses. Well, that's pretty difficult for starters. I'm going to be concentrating quite hard on that. So my situational awareness is probably coming down a bit. And then I have to let somebody else do it. It's not very difficult, as you know, if you're doing something like that, to put on 100 feet or so without knowing it. So that sort of accuracy of flying, but managing the distractions, making sure one's knowledge is up to date, and allowing sensible safety margins is really some top tips arising from what we hear from people.
Thank you, Mike. Good tips there. What about the tools that are out there for GA pilots as far as ATC provision goes? Listening out squawks, LARs, the FISO units, etc. Amanda, what have you got out there that can help us? And what do you think is the best option for you? If you're sitting there as a radar controller, you've got aircraft that are flying, for example, shooting the gap between Heathrow and Luton, what would you want them to be doing?
Well, for between Heathrow and Luton, you've got Farnborough LARs. They're a good service to utilise, with it being such a busy bit of airspace. If you're going to be flying close to Stansted Luton, then we have the frequency monitoring codes. So we now have one for Stansted, one for Luton, so we can tell which sector you're listening out on. So if it does look like you're going to get a little bit close, it's not our responsibility to make sure that you remain clear. But if the controller does see it, thinks, you're heading for my airspace, I know I've done it and I've done a blind transmission, I believe you're here, you may be entering controlled airspace in the next 2 miles, just be advised. And at that point they've gone, oh yes, because they may not have been this sort of paying attention or weren't aware. So that's been very helpful, the frequency monitoring codes. Or if you do want to talk to Stansted or Luton, you give us a call, but if we are busy, we might just give you a basic service. You may not even get a squawk if it is just a basic service. but at least we know you're out there.
So last year, well, the past 2 years, Amanda, and we know full well that every opportunity that GA had to get airborne, right back at the beginning, it's maintenance checks. I'll do the maintenance check this time, please.
Yeah.
But as soon as any restrictions were lifted, the pilots were up there and flying. When there may not have been a lot of commercial activity there, so we saw a lot of GA traffic going through controlled airspace and doing low approaches and go-arounds at airfields where it wouldn't normally have happened.
Totally, yeah.
So that provided a unique opportunity to get access to airspace that may have been off limits to GA. What's your take on how ATC and GA pilots should handle these requests or the expectations of flying through controlled airspace now?
Now the commercial traffic has really started to pick up. Of course, the availability of transits, or again, just go through the overhead. I've had traffic ask, can I go through the overhead, then do a 180 and go southbound again or northbound again. Late notice requests, be ready that you may not get the routings that you've had before, because we are much busier now, and of course our focus is elsewhere. We will always try and accommodate where we can, but it's back to having a plan B. Don't be surprised if the answer is no, stand by, I'll call you back in 5 minutes, or even maybe speak to an adjacent unit because you are that busy. But yeah, we did have a lot of requests, and so much more the GA traffic was coming through different zones and seeing things and going places they'd never normally be able to get to because of the volume of traffic. But now with the commercial traffic coming back, that's having to be restricted more because we just don't have the capacity or the ability to allow it safely.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. I know we've got a load of questions that are popping through from the audience that are here. So before we go there, we've had a load of top tips there from Mike about what we can do to make things better and safer. Any top tips from you, Amanda, that you think you could give general aviation pilots in their build up to flying now? In gorgeous weather like we've had, they're all coming back to flying. What are your top tips?
Well, my top tip: don't be scared to speak to air traffic. We may sound intimidating when we're busy, but we're really not. If at any point you're unsure as to where you are, or if you think you're going to get close to controlled airspace, call us. We're always there. And there's also D&D as well. They've got the wonderful RAF people down at Swanwick. There is always people out there you can talk to and you can ask for help for, and never be afraid of that.
I'd agree 100% with that. It's one of the things I'm working on at the moment is use of RT in helping to avoid airspace infringements or avoid problems elsewhere. And some things I have found are pilots, even after they're qualified, are scared to use the radio. And you're not going to get any better if you don't try. So it's all about practice. And I think that the one thing about this, hopefully, we have the audience here, you can see we've got 2 air traffic controllers on here. We're perfectly normal people, we're nice people. And if you come and meet us for a chat in the tower when you're allowed, we'll make you cups of tea all day long. Don't be afraid of talking to us. We've got some audience questions that are coming up now, and I think we've covered some of those already. From Amanda, you may have touched on this a bit already. Would you rather a GA pilot use the listening squawks or ask for a basic service from you?
Well, so that's a difficult one. It depends how close are you going to get to my airspace. If you're on the frequency monitoring code, I know you are there. I can see you. You're part of my scan. If I think you may get close and I have the capability to speak to you, I will do. If you've dialed onto the frequency, listen out for a little bit first and see, is it busy? If it is busy, the likelihood of getting any kind of service will be limited. Basic service, we'll do what we can, but of course we still need to get all your details, what's your call sign, where you're from, where you're going. So the frequency monitoring code for both Stansted and Luton, for me, is a good one to go to first. Okay.
Mike, any hints and tips from you on that?
No, I think Amanda's summed that up brilliantly. I mean, the fact is, if you've got the listening squawk there and the radar frequency, it's usually the radar frequency set the appropriate frequency. The top tip, though, is make sure the volume's turned up and make sure you're listening to it, because that's the reason you've done it. So that's the top tip. But it's a good selection, because what it's telling Amanda is that actually you know you're near Luton in her case, but you've no intention of going into controlled airspace. but you're going to listen out because you're near, and if there's anything that you need to know about, she'll get in touch with you. So you've done your bit. It also really alleviates the problem of Luton's normally busy, so a lot of extra RT. And then the other thing it does is when you've finished with the frequency, well, you can just change. You don't have to tell people that you're leaving the frequency, which can be difficult because, you know, the range may be such that you then don't hear other traffic and you stamp on them in your transmission or whatever, or you keep calling and Amanda can hear you, can't hear her. So it does make things a lot easier. So I think it's a good system to use. I think that's the thing there that so I'm into listening squawks, but don't be afraid to make a call if you feel it would help. And the other thing I suppose I should say is that GA radio standards, probably RT procedure could be a bit better, I think. Most people in GA would say that. So I'm not going to ask for the air traffic control opinion. That's an honest self-evaluation. And therefore, that's something else we could work on. But of course, if we never talk to air traffic control, then it won't get any better because we'll lose even confidence. So there is a slight danger of that. So on occasions, if it's quiet, it might be nice just to have a chat with your friendly air traffic controller, ask for a basic service, and you know, just make sure that your position report is accurate and brief, really, I think, and think about what you're going to say. Also, I think we mentioned it, you know, I've mentioned it many times. Try and, you know, sound as if you know what you're doing on the radio. It's really important. And if Amanda's had to ask you, you know, for your call sign several times because you weren't listening or something, or you're doing something else, or you misread back the squawk or the QNH a few times, that could indicate you just got a poor radio, or it could indicate you're not very good, or it could indicate you're not confident. Whatever it indicates, what it does tell Amanda is that probably this is a risk. So if you then ask to control, you know, to transit her airspace, she might well say, well, look, no, you know, remain clear of controlled airspace because I've got a lot of traffic. And that's it. Because, you know, perhaps the last thing that she would want to do in those circumstances, to have you in mishearing a critical bit of information at a time when it was really quite important with regard to maintaining separation from another aircraft. So top tip, listen out's great, turn the volume up and do listen out.
There's a couple of things. Right. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Amanda.
No, I said, well said. It's perfect. If you sound like you know what you're doing, or if you don't hear me, ask me again. Don't be afraid to ask me if you haven't heard what I've said or you don't understand it. I will do that. If I don't hear a pilot, I will go say again until I know what is going on. So I expect that from the GA crews if they're not sure as to what I have asked you to do or the point I've asked you to route to. So yeah, well put.
I think there's some things we also need to be clear about and also careful about when we're talking about the use of frequency monitoring codes, and that's that they aren't the get out of jail free card if it comes to getting close to controlled airspace or going in. It's not, you don't have a clearance to enter controlled airspace, and the controller may actually miss a controlled airspace bust. I've seen one happen at Birmingham when I was sat in the tower and an aircraft wearing a 0010 squawk entered the zone to the north, and I called down to the radar controller to say you've got a 0010 in the zone, and he went, oops. Whereas Amanda, you've got Kate, which I'm sure will alert you to that. But it's certainly one to be aware of.
So yeah, everything. If something enters controlled airspace on a squawk that isn't supposed to be there, it will go magenta, and everybody sees it. Then you're ready to again. Have I lost separation? Do I need to give avoiding action to maintain separation? Immediately, that's an infringement because I'm not talking to you. I haven't validated or verified you, so I don't know if your altitude is correct. I don't know your intentions. So again, we're back to the infringement scenario of trying to keep everybody away from you, because you're not supposed to be there.
And the other thing on use of the basic service, and we have to be really clear about what the controller provides on a basic service, because it is basic information. It's information on, it could be a danger area activity that's going on, any weather that may be around on your route. But the crucial thing about a basic service, and please, Amanda, correct me, it's 8 years since I've done radar. A controller does not actually have to identify an aircraft. The identification is the act of the controller knowing 100% certain that dot on that radar screen is you that they're talking to. And on a basic service, that doesn't have to be the case. So they don't actually need to know exactly where you are. So it may be that another service may be more preferable if you want to be placed exactly. If you're on a listening out squawk, the controller knows they can call you straight away. And if you're mode S, they'll know your call sign. Amanda, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Basic service. I personally will more often not give a squawk, but I will say for my purposes, you are identified, but it is a basic service. I am just going to give you any pertinent information, my pressure setting. Again, the looting case, if Dunstable are gliding, I'll advise you of that. But that's all I have to. I do not have to identify you. Again, if you want anything else like a traffic service, then yes, I have to identify you, find out where you are, confirm your level or your altitude, and then I will provide you with a traffic service. At that point, you can expect traffic to be called rather than with a basic service, identification is not required.
Just one that's making me smile here, Amanda. Use of autopilot. I remember congratulating a Monarch crew on a good landing in what were quite rough conditions, and then they told me they were using the autopilot. Would the controller know if they're flying through controlled airspace whether a pilot's on autopilot or not?
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't have a clue.
No.
I think if you were to see a very straight line track, that's just that could be an autopilot. It just could be somebody's heading holding brilliantly, couldn't it? Where you'd probably detect it is if you had a vertical view, and that would really only apply with an autopilot glide slope or something, where the aircraft comes absolutely down the glide slope with no excursions at all. That could indicate there was a bit of mechanical help. But you don't have, when you're looking at your normal radar display, of course, it doesn't have that on it. And you just, the altitude readout, I suppose if it's going up and down all the time, if you could remember that, because you only look at it at that scan, don't you? You don't look at many scans back. If you'd noticed it was all up and down, I suppose you could say there. But really, manual flying should produce accurate flying. We should fly accurately. So that's it. I was looking at the questions really coming in, and there's that one interested me as well. But there was another one about the wire zone transit request have been denied, and I was just going to say, well, there is a form you can fill in, and that's available. It's not that easy to find. I don't think it gets answered though. I think you get thank you for submitting your form, but I don't know that you get an explanation. So I don't know whether you think maybe a call to the supervisor afterwards may tell you. I mean, they're busy as well, but I don't think, and you certainly shouldn't enter into any conversation on the air because you're busy. I mean, presumably the zone transit has been denied. Not out of cussedness or awkwardness, because you're busy, and therefore, any explanations over the frequency at the time wouldn't be appropriate. Afterwards, I suppose you could telephone and say, "Is there anything I could have done to have facilitated my clearance?" I don't know.
A lot of the time, the reason the answer is no is purely because of workload. I don't know if everyone or sort of the GA community are aware of the amount of coordination that goes on behind the scenes. Say Anthony's in the tower, I'm on radar, and Mike, you want to transit north to south with the Luton overhead. You'll call me up, I'll get your details, requesting zone transit. Roger. So I will then, if I can get you through, I will find a gap in the inbound traffic. I'll give you a clearance limit to the north. I now have to ring Anthony, identify you to him, say what aircraft type you are, what your intentions are, what I'm going to do. So you're going to be holding north of the field by 2 miles, not above 2,040 feet VFR. I will keep and I will call traffic. If Anthony has no outbound traffic to affect, he's normally happy. I would advise the inbounds of your position. I then have to advise you of the inbounds. If you were to deviate at any point, I then have to ring Anthony back again and say there's been a change of plan. So the amount of talking and the amount of phone calls, the amount of information passing just for one zone transit really can up your workload. And if as a radar controller you call on requesting transit, I'm thinking, I don't have the capacity to do this safely. If we negative, remain outside controlled airspace. Again, we never do it out of spite. You know that it is, again, with the commercial traffic coming back, it's getting harder and harder to accommodate the requests that we've had from the GA community over the last sort of 18 months.
I think that's one of the things to be aware of, Amanda. You know, we've had a lot of freedoms over the past 2 years, and don't be surprised if some of those freedoms do go down a little bit. At the end of the day, this is all about safety, and the Class D airspace is there to protect the heavy metal that's going around the circuit and in and out of these airfields. Mike, were you saying something there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I thought that was a tremendously good explanation. Thanks for that, Amanda, because I don't think we realise what work goes on. Now, I've visited towers quite often, radar controllers, but it's not an opportunity we get so much these days. For the pandemic, it's quite obvious why we haven't been able to do it. But for some years before, it's usually been difficult with security. And you know, Gasco used to arrange visits to towers. Maybe we can get back to that, because if you can see what goes on, all those phone calls that have to be made, we probably realise why sometimes the answer's no.
Got a couple of minutes here for another question. I think it's pretty similar to some of the things we've spoken about earlier. And again, Amanda, coming to you. If we're flying close to controlled airspace and not likely to infringe, so our navigation's good, we know where we are, would you prefer that we make a courtesy call to ATC, assuming that we're listening and it's quiet?
Personally, I can't speak for my colleagues, for me, but yes, if you're going to be running quite close to the edge of controlled airspace, I would rather you were speaking to me. So I know who you are, I know what level you're at, I know your intentions. I have had traffic follow the zone boundary exactly, and I'm thinking if you turn left, you're coming into controlled airspace, and that's when the whole infringement scenario starts. So yeah, I would rather you're speaking to me. Again, if the RT's quiet, call in, give me your details. I'm going to be landing here shortly. Brilliant stuff.
Thank you, Amanda. Okay.
Do you want me, Paul, to just, there was an earlier question about apps, wasn't there? Shall I just run through very quickly?
Oh, you can do, yes. Yeah. We've got a question
or two left
regarding. Oh no, that's I think that's for the audience questions. We've got some which we've had previously that we want to look at, and we feel we should talk to the audience about. And this was particularly to do with any apps or websites that you feel would be useful. Well, that we'd recommend.
Yeah, I think the first one I would recommend is a CAA Skywise. About 50% or more of GA pilots have it downloaded. It's just been updated a little bit, and so it's slightly less clunky, which you don't have to do the login bit now. It's really very good. It means that you get all your airspace and lots of other things, you know, mandatory permanent directives and various other notices and things like that will come out on Skywise, and notice of safety events and things like that. So I would make sure, I think all GA pilots should have that, and tune it for what you'll do. So if you're a PPLA, you can just have NOTAMs or information that is relevant to PPLAs. If you're a commercial pilot, you can have what's relevant to you, or indeed an air traffic controller. So I'd recommend Skywise. I think I mentioned earlier that people don't always get the big picture with a Met. So I would recommend strongly either visiting the Met Office website, or indeed they have a very good app and some very good links and explanations, and get the forecast information from there. There are many other apps you can get with weather. Try and understand where they got the weather from and the model. Often you'll talk to one pilot, they'll say, oh, I use that, it's always right. And then the other ones say this one's always right, and so on. It could be just luck, of course, but I'm not decrying them. They're good, and make sure you get as much information about the weather as you possibly can. I think the UK Airprox board run a very good app, worth downloading, all free, and you could look at all the Airprox reports reported on a map. And that would be quite good to have a look at the ones in your local area, because it may sort of indicate choke points and things which could be part of your threat and error management. I'd also, the Chirp website and app is very good. If you want to make a confidential report, they have it, but they also have a general aviation section, and it's good reading, and it helps you perhaps avoid some of the traps that other people have got into. Reporting is important. I'm not going to deal with that now, but you need to do that through the CAA site. On websites, well, a must is obviously the GASCO website. So I'm going to promote that, where we have details of all our forthcoming safety events. And the Airspace and Safety Initiative website, another must really for finding out more about. And many tips. It's got a super hotspot infringement section, so you can have a look at that. If you're flying near one of the major airports, it's probably got one, that Luton certainly has, and you can see where people infringe. So it would be a good idea not to go there, or to take extra care if you have to. So there's all of that sort of stuff there. Okay. And I think the question also asked about recommendations on moving NATS. Well, there are many out there, and they're all very good, I think. There are some leaders and favourites in the field. I think the best thing to do is to talk to an experienced user, somebody you trust, another pilot, and particularly go to your flying instructor, your ATO, your DTO, whatever, and ask them for advice. What would you suggest for me? And then that way, that's what I would do.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Another question we've had come in here prior to the session. We've had a question regarding air pressure and how system or systems deal with it, and they'd like us to talk about the importance of air pressure and what pilots need to be aware of. I know, Amanda, this can be particularly important from your perspective.
It can be. You think of the TMZs around Stansted where the base is 1,500 feet. If you're on a different pressure setting, on the regional pressure setting, with potentially flight information, this could end up as being a bust coming through the basic controlled airspace. Even though you're on the regional pressure and that's correct for the region, it can be very different for the local airfield. Even if, for example, like we've had bad weather going through, I've seen the Heathrow QNH and the Stansted QNH be 7 hectopascals difference. And that's a big difference. So yes, if you're flying below the London TMA around Stansted, I recommend using the Stansted QNH around Luton. The Luton, there's not normally much in it, but just be aware of that. The regional pressure can inadvertently put you through the basic controlled airspace. Mike,
do we have anything from you to wrap this up before we go?
Just to thank everybody for coming, and thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed being part of your team and meeting Amanda and you, and I hope that we'll be able to do this again. We could talk all day, couldn't we, about this subject?
We could, yeah.
But I think there have been some really good points raised, so thank you for the opportunity. Somebody asked about what, one of the questions in advance was what they would do about how to take up flying. Can I suggest they just privately send me an email? My email's really easy. It's on our website, but it's ce@gasco.org.uk. And I'd be very happy to talk to anybody about what GASCO does, and I'll give that advice on to the person that asked it. So thanks once again.
Thank you. Amanda, last words from you.
Thank you both very much. It's been a real pleasure and a real insight for me as well. But don't be afraid to speak to air traffic. We're not big and we're not scary. Again, when we're busy, it can sound very intimidating if you're not used to speaking to air traffic. But give us a call and don't be afraid to ask if you don't hear us or don't understand. That's what we're there for.
I'd echo that. Thank you very much, Amanda. Well, that's about it then. I'd like to give a huge thanks to Mike and Amanda for all their expertise, and thank you to everyone who's come onto this and shared their questions as well. We'll be back next month for another episode of Altitude, so please keep an eye on our social media feeds for information, as well as details on how to watch back today's show. Thanks again, everyone. Goodbye.